Hi and welcome to Gender. We're going to look at gender and close relationships and looking at the relationship models and just what the meanings of some of this is all about. So let's get exploring into close relationships. So we'll start with the meaning of personal relationship. Personal relationships are those in which partners depend on each other for various things ranging from material assistance, things, right through to affection, which are emotion-based. Now, partners regard each other as unique individuals who cannot be replaced. Many of the relationships we form, only a few of these relationships that we all form, only a few become very personal. You might have very many acquaintances, you might even have a lot of people you call friends, and then you start getting into this narrower view of those people who are particularly specific and special to us, who are irreplaceable. Many people out here are replaceable. The people here are not. They could be family, they could be close personal friends who you would trust. Now, research demonstrates that people often choose friends and romantic partners who, now this is going to be surprising for some of you, who are similar to themselves in terms of age, gender, race, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status. Now, the part that I'm trying to emphasize here is that we often hear opposites attract. But in reality, people who have successful relationships often are successful because they are more similar to the people that they become partners with, not different. It's an interesting observation about common sense versus research-based. LGBTQ individuals are more likely to refer to friends as family. Models of the personal relationship, while there's a difference in the masculine and feminine orientations to close relationships, often reflect male and female approaches to relationships, and that shouldn't surprise you. Some scholars will argue that masculine approaches to relationships are inferior to feminine ones, while others think the two styles are equal. And we're going to look at these as a way of distinguishing those two philosophies. The first, meaning that masculine approach to relationships is inferior to feminine, is known as the male deficit model. And it suggests that feminine individuals are relationship experts and view feminine ways of forming and maintaining relationships as the right way to engage in intimacy, and that the masculine style of building and maintaining relationships is inadequate. The male deficit model views personal, emotional self-disclosure as the key to close relationships. Emotional talk is seen as the most important part of an intimacy. Now, there's much academic and popular sentiment that maintains that men are less able than women to express emotions and to care. These approaches hold that since self-disclosure is so important to intimacy, men's and boys' friendships are less intimate than women's and girls', and that men emphasize activities to avoid intimacy. Media often represents men as emotionally lacking and women as naturally adept at relationships. Now, the alternative, and as we would see that men and women's are equal, is what's known as the alternative paths model. And it asserts that there's different routes to creating and sustaining close relationships that are equally valid for creating closeness. While this model agrees with the male deficit model that socialization is the source of difference between feminine and masculine styles of relating, it departs in two different ways. Now, it's important to note the socialization is at the root of what both of these are at, and these are each a different view to explain close relationships. So you don't have to see one as being right and the other as being wrong. These are alternative views of which research does support these two views. The alternative path, suggests that masculine socialization discourages masculine individuals from expressing their feelings verbally and limits their chances to practice emotional disclosure. So it's important to note that within socialization, this is what our society influences family, and families that influence us can communicate that. And this is maybe more representative of the 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, where this is what boys do, this is what girls do. We could argue that we're seeing a more egalitarian perspective, and some of this was going to change over time. The alternative path model also argues that masculine people do express closeness, but they do it in a way that is different, but equally valid than ways that feminine people express. This model also challenges the research that was used to justify the male deficit model, noting that these studies defined and measured men's closeness using the feminine ruler. Okay, now I don't mean that in terms of, the feminine ruler as being the prince or the queen or the whatever. No, the feminine ruler, the measuring stick, that judge men's relationships based on the feminine norms. Instead of the self-disclosure, masculine people tend to express closeness by doing things together. This does not mean, however, that they don't self-disclose or engage in emotional talk. The only way I can sort of give an example about that, my dad and I would, he'd come up to visit me from time to time, and he's old school from the point of view that I don't remember him doing any sort of self-disclosure and emotional bonding with me. However, all through our lives, we would get together when I was younger, when I left home, and as I got older, he'd come up and we'd spend 8-10 hours working outdoors on tasks. And he would say at the end, "Man, was that ever good? And it's so good to spend so much good time with you, and it was a good bonding." So for him, the closeness was in the doing. Not a lot would necessarily be said, but what was said and how we interacted with one another seemed to promote this sort of closeness that maybe is different than the way females will have been taught to do the same thing. Let's carry on. Expectations and behavior in close relationships can also vary in response to a friend's gender. The more information a man shares on a social network site, the more likely a viewer is to pursue social interactions with them. But women, the opposite is true. Both men and women judge a friend more harshly for betraying confidence if that friend is female. Interesting. So let's look at gendered styles of friendship. Now, there are many similarities between the friendships. Regardless of sex or gender, most individuals value close friends and invest in them. That's just to say that however similar or different men and women form friendships, both value close friends and both will invest in those relationships. Now, most people use both feminine and masculine approaches to friendships, and that's an important note. That might be something that is emerging. Women are more likely to communicate face to face. Men tend to interact side by each, or side by side. Women's friendships tend to be built through dialogue, typically about personal feelings, experiences, fears, problems, daily lives, and activities. Talk is the primary way to build and enrich a friendship and exists as an evolving dialogue. It grows and develops over time. A majority of women talk as the primary way to build and enrich friendships. Consequently, many share personal feelings, experiences, fears, problems, and daily lives to get to know each other. Women tend to maintain higher expectations of their friends in matters related to trust and intimacy, and communication tends to be empathetic, expressive, and supportive. Because women are generally socialized to be attentive, emotionally supportive, and caring, it can be difficult for women friends to cope with feelings of envy, competitiveness towards friends. Female friends often discuss the qualities and dimensions of their relationships explicitly. Now, what's interesting about that, when you talk in terms of talking about your relationship, that's called meta-communication. That's like digging down into the relationship a little bit and looking at the quality of it. And that's something that women's friends tend to do more than men's friends. Women's friendships are often characterized by breadth that introduces friends to many different aspects of each other's lives. Men's friendships tend to center on doing activities together, such as engaging in sports, watching games, or other shared activity. Closeness in doing describes the way men build friendships. Getting together to sit around after a ball game and drink beers in a garage is the activity of doing, if you will, without there having to be a content that's intimate and self-disclosure. Now, many men perceive talking as one way rather than the only and best way to build relationships. When they do talk, they tend to talk about activities. Men tend to seek companions rather than confidants in their friendships. Men's friendships may have an instrumental focus. Instrumental meaning the doing aspects as opposed to expressive, which are relationship developing, in which men do things to help one another out. This may also take in form of the divisionary activities when faced with problems rather than explicit, expressive conversations about them. Men tend to talk indirectly about their serious feelings with other men. Often serious emotional issues are shrouded in a joke talk. Men's relationships may involve covert intimacy in which the affection is signaled through teasing, friendly competition, playful punches, etc., as a means of demonstrating care. Men's friendships tend to be narrower in scope than women's friendships, with different friends for various spheres of interests. Men might have friends for sports, friends for music, friends for other activities, and friends for camping, whereas women may have friends where they share all of those things. Because of the high emphasis we place on gender in culture, women and men may see each other as in sexual terms. And so what does that do for friendships? For many women, the primary benefit of friendships with men is a less emotionally intense relationship. Men report getting more emotional support and release from their friendships with women. Women also report getting more emotional support from their female friends. That mirrors that of men. So both sexes report that their friendships with women are closer than those with men. Now this may be why both sexes seek out women friends at times of stress. So let's step into this gendered romantic relationship. Heterosexual romantic relationships tend to follow a typical script in which traditional gender roles are emphasized. Now, a script really here isn't about a word for word, everyone gets a script, and when it's appropriate time to use whatever script, you pull it out and you start reading from it. But it is used as a term to say that there are roles that we play, and there's guides on how we date or how we form romantic relationships, and it's following that script. At one point, the script would indicate that the man needs to instigate or start this intimacy by asking someone out for a date, and then how many dates do you need to do before you can hold hands or kiss? So there's a script. Now that script changes over time. But the point here is that heterosexual relationships, because that's been largely the norm in our North American society, so it comes with a script. Developing romantic intimacy, heterosexual men and women seek fairly traditional masculine and feminine partners when men men prioritizing physical attractiveness and sexiness, and women prioritizing status and success. Now, some of those things are, again, changing. We're in a really interesting time that way. Most heterosexual couples conform to a script in which men take some more active roles in planning dates. Gay men and lesbians are less likely to conform to a standard script. And the script, like I said, it's not a written the script to read. It's really just the sort of social norm on how we establish intimate relationships. Now, research indicates that men actually tend to fall in love faster and harder than women. Men tend to express love in more impulsive sexual ways than women, whose styles of loving tend to be much more pragmatic and friendship focused. Heterosexual men are far more likely to regard sexual infidelity as more distressing than emotional infidelity. Attitudes towards sexual behavior, while less rigid than in the past, still indicate that women who express sexuality openly or have non-traditional relationships are often judged more harshly than men. Now, cisgender heterosexual women tend to engage in sex for intimacy and commitment reasons, while cisgender heterosexual men are more motivated by lust and physical pleasure. Lesbians, on the other hand, place a greater premium on monogamy. Gay men report greater comfort with open relationships. Women, they regard sexual orientation, regardless of sexual orientation, are more likely than men to focus on relationship dynamics. Committed heterosexual relationships tend to continue to reflect the cultural values and beliefs, with men as the head of the family and the primary wage earner, and women primarily in charge of domestic aspects of relationships. Now, that particular part of the script, I think, is really dramatically changing in today's society, with more women working, families starting later, and then married couples both having primary incomes. Gay and lesbian relationships are not as bound by roles. Their commitments often resemble best friend relationships, with the added aspect of sexuality and romance. So if we now move into some of the gendered patterns of committed relationships, well, we'll start by gendered modes of expressing affection. Women tend to create and express closeness through personal self-disclosure talk. Self-disclosure talk would include the dialogue you have with only those select few people whom you absolutely trust, to talk about things you don't talk about with everybody else and express your true feelings. Men rely more on instrumental displays of affection, the things that we do together. For women, ongoing conversations about feelings and daily activities is a primary way of expressing personal relationships, but men find it pointless to talk unless there's a problem. And you might have noticed this in some of your relationships, is that women might prefer to dialogue about how we're doing and the emotional content of our relationship, while men will prefer to talk when there's a problem so they can actively be a part of solving it. There is cultural bias towards feminine forms of expressing love, often not recognizing instrumental displays of affection. And again, I would see this where she would, and I've been a counselor for quite a few years, not lately, but in the past. And the dialogues with couples would be, well, I say I love him all the time. He never tells me. And he's saying, yes, but I take out the garbage, I do the lawn, I do these activities. He's saying, these are me saying that to you without using the words. And so that sort of disparity between men and women, it's not surprising that it provides some sort of uncomfortableness and some quality questions about the relationship. Lesbian and gay couples, they may share perspectives about how to communicate affection. Lesbians generally build the most expressive, nurturing communication climates of any of the other couple arrangements. So now this component that we're going to enter into is gendered preferences for autonomy and connection. Now, autonomy is just the sense of ability to work independently and have the freedom of doing that, whereas connectedness is doing things together and in collaboration. Both masculine and feminine individuals desire personal freedom and a feeling of interconnectedness. Now, interconnectedness is just this sort of note that I don't like to do things by myself and alone, and I don't want to do things with you all the time, but this interconnectedness means that we keep in touch and we share. Feminine individuals socialize to focus on relationships generally are comfortable with greater levels of connection. Masculine individuals socialize towards independence, typically want greater autonomy. The differences in desire for autonomy and connection can lead to problems in relationships when behaviors are interpreted as from differing perspectives, and that this, of course, makes sense. This may lead to the demand withdrawal pattern, in which one partner feels distance, so attempts to engage in closeness, personal talk, leaving the other feeling stifled by the discussion. More damaging, though, is the tendency to interpret each other's behavior according to the gender rules that don't apply to the other's behavior. And that's key to any relationship, is to not judge what they say and do based on what you think they should say and do, because it's what you would say and do. It's about understanding each other from each other's perspective. And that's hard to do, and that's why relationship building can be very difficult. So respect for different needs for autonomy and connection is essential in successful relationship building. So when we think in terms of the responsibility for the relationship health, well, lesbian couples tend to be sensitive to interpersonal dynamics and interested in talking about the relationship and working through problems, whereas heterosexual couples do not distribute responsibility for relationship health well. Both men and women tend to assume women should be the primary responsible person for the relationship maintenance. Now, that too may be changing. Expectations for one partner's responsibility for ensuring relational health can lead to problems. Now, research shows that the greater satisfaction has been identified in relationships where relationship maintenance is shared. And that, again, sort of makes sense. Now, in relationships, there is also gendered power dynamics. So just how is power shared or influencing relationships? Well, since historically the person who makes the most money in a heterosexual relationship tends to be given the most power, men's traditional breadwinner role has afforded them the greater power in many relationships. Now, this dynamic tends not to be present in gay and lesbian relationships. Tensions arise over the role of primary breadwinner, particularly for those who subscribe to the traditional gender roles, but whose paycheck violate these expectations. So what if you're the male in a relationship with a woman who makes more money than he does? And that's what I'm saying there. If that changes, well, people who adhere to the traditional role models view in marriage are more likely to experience a decrease in self-esteem and marital satisfaction if the woman earns more money, because that breaches that particular belief. Now, if you don't hold to that script, you might see that she making more money than you as being irrelevant. It doesn't matter. It's us as a couple. And that's where I think things have been started to move to. In heterosexual relationships, women tend to do more work in the home, including the housework, caregiving, than do men. And this is true even when both partners work, and even when women earns considerably more than the men. Gay and lesbian couples are more likely than heterosexual couples to divide childcare and household labor equally between the partners. Men who share in childcare tend to have less conflict in their relationships and more satisfying sex. Now, it shouldn't be that satisfying sex is dependent on being a parent, of sharing the responsibility of parenthood. However, it generally makes the overall family unit, particularly husband and wife, feel more connected and more a part of the same couple. Now, one key reason for unequal contributions to domestic labor is gender ideology. Men and women with different traditional beliefs are more likely to perceive it as inappropriate for women to do most of the domestic labor. Women who don't perceive desirable alternatives to their current relationships, have little leverage to persuade their partner to participate more. Committed to equality by both partners will affect how they divide domestic chores. Gender socialization teaches girls to perform more traditionally feminine tasks and have developed those skills as adults. Millennial men are more egalitarian in their views related to gender, family, and career within marriages. And that's one of these sort of this broad shift in close relationships, I think, is beginning to shift to more egalitarian. Now, this referred to as the second shift, this is where women's duties of taking care of the home and family members after arriving home from work tend to be taxing. Part of the routine is repetitive and it's not very rewarding. The domestic work women do is often more taxing, less gratifying than that, done by men, and are repetitive routines that are constrained by deadlines. The second shift is something that doesn't get experienced by men. But when couples share those responsibilities and talk about those, then that second shift becomes less noticeable because men are picking up and doing more of the parenting and the household work. Now, reasons why men and women engage in differing amounts of domestic labor are complex and include adherence to traditional gender ideology, a woman's access to relationship alternatives, and the desire for equity. Because women consider becoming a mother to be a choice, they may assume they are responsible to meet all the other demands related to that choice. Although men continue to do less domestic labor than women, men's participation in domestic sphere has been increasing considerably since the 1960s. Women have the psychological responsibility for planning, remembering things that need to be done, and increases the burden of that second shift duties. If you need to know when people were married and what their birthdays are, ask your partner, female partner. She'll probably remember. Most guys tend not to remember that. At least that's the more traditional way. But that, again, I keep repeating it, is starting to change. Consequences of the second shift include stress, fatigue, illness, and resentment. Heterosexual couples who share equally in running a home and raising a family are much more satisfied than that traditional pattern. Another indicator of power dynamics is how couples manage conflict. Masculine individuals tend to use unilateral strategies, and what I mean by unilateral, it's very black and white. We either do this or we do that. It's black and white. And it's got to be this way or it's no way. Okay, so they tend to engage more strategies to engage in and to avoid conflicts through strategies such as ultimatums, refusing to discuss an issue, or to assert that the problem is being blown out of proportion, that these are the directions that men may typically make. The feminine individuals tend to employ indirect strategies when they do engage in conflict, or they defer or compromise to reduce the tension. None of those are particularly good conflict management styles. These are other conflict management approaches, but they have consequences that are also undesirable. Gender power dynamics are also reflected in patterns of violence and abuse. Acts of violence tend to be inflicted most typically by men who have been socialized into masculine identities and cuts across race, ethnic, and class lines. Violent behavior is a product of gender, not sex. That meaning it's not the biological differences between men and women which explain assault and violent behavior. It's the socialization of what it is to be male and what it is to be female that's responsible for the violent behavior, if you will. One study reported that both male and female abusers tend to have masculine gendered orientation. Now, that's been a relatively quick review of close relationships. I hope it's been useful and helpful for you. I look forward to seeing you next week in the next chapter's material. Bye for now.